Good morning. Thanks so much for introducing me. Firstly, I would like to thank the program committee for accepting my paper. Today, I'm going to talk about music and rhetoric, recorded performances of the Prelude by Johann Sebastian Bach Suite 2 for solo cello. Let us begin by tracing the origins of rhetoric, which it can be dated back to 485 before Christ, where it emerged with a political and judicial purpose. Homer and Isidore defined it ante dolere et delectare, to instruct and delight, and centuries later, Quintilian would have movere, to arouse. Although rhetoric evolved in manifold ways throughout the centuries, it never faded completely. In the Renaissance, interest in classical rhetoric reappeared through humanists such as Erasmus of Rotterdam and Thomas More, and in the Baroque period, Quants proposed that musicians and orators share a common goal, to influence their audience by arousing their passions and moving their feelings. To achieve this effect, a speech or musical work must be constructed according to the 5 rhetorical operations: inventio, dispositio, elocutio, memoria, and actio. As I will explain later, all my work will focus on actio. In Lutheran Germany, there was a particular interest in rhetoric as a means of spreading the spoken word, just like music. Dietrich Waltel explains that at that time, both music and rhetoric aims to move the listener. From there, composers of the time, like Johann Sebastian Bach, naturally applied rhetorical principles to their compositions. One of the resources they used to achieve this was rhetorical figures of speech. Various treatises focuses on systematizing musical rhetorical figures, such as those by Burmeister and Matheson. Even if most rhetorical figures refer to textual issues, they can be reinterpreted in terms of performance. Today, I'm going to focus on 6 rhetorical figures: periphrasis, palilogia, synonymia, polyptoton, synalifa, and diastole. In this context, I discuss the relationship between musical performance and rhetoric. More specifically, I analyze how changes in musical parameters made by performers can be related to rhetorical figures, serving the purpose of acting as a modifying resource of the resulting interpretation. For this reason, of the 5 rhetorical operations, my work is centered on actio, that is, the act of performance. While Bach's suite for solo cello had been studied apropos their sources and composition process, performance focuses research on them is limited. Some scholars have studied the performance of Bach's cello works, focusing on intonation, durational fluctuation, and other parameters in a specific movement of each suite, or by a single specific performer. This communication focuses on some recordings of the Prelude of the second suite for solo cello in D minor by Johann Sebastian Bach. The Prelude was chosen over other dances because within the Baroque suite, it's the most improvisational piece, allowing for greater interpretative freedom. In particular, the final 5 bars constitute one of the most outstanding sections of this prelude, both from a compositional and oral point of view. The long chords allowed performers a wide range of interpretative options, from keeping them as written to elaborating them with arpeggios or incorporating new musical motifs. Another important section in terms of interpretation is the 4 bars preceding the end, bars 54 to 57, as bar 58 could function as a bridge between the 2 sections. At first glance, it may seem like a simple transition to the conclusion. However, when analyzed from an oral and interpretative perspective, interesting details emerge. Although the total research covers more than 120 recordings of all the preludes, today I'm going to discuss 2 of them to illustrate the analysis being done. I will work with 2 recordings by Anner Wiersma, who belongs to the historically informed performance tradition. The first recording is from 1979 and the second from 1992. So there is a 13-year gap between them. This will allow us to observe any changes in his interpretative perspective. The first steps in the analysis was to spend time listening carefully to each recording before moving on to the analytical part of the study. This allowed me to identify the most relevant sections for analysis by ear. To extract quantitative data, the time instants in digital recordings were marked manually at the semi-quaver level using the free software Sony Visualizer. The time values were then obtained, allowing me to extract the tempo in BPM based on duration from the previous item and the duration data in seconds until the next item. To find temporal patterns among the recordings, percentage values had to be used. Each bar was considered the main grouping unit, like it were 100% or 1. Next, the percentage duration of each beat within the bar was calculated. Based on the tempo and duration data, I analyzed other interpretative parameters, such as the use of short silence or micropauses. Finally, other parameters such as phrasing and articulation will be mentioned more superficially during the analysis, although empirical data was also obtained for them. To facilitate interpretation, this is presented graphically. Once all the data has been obtained and analyzed, I establish a possible relationship with the rhetorical figures. I have chosen the case of Anner Bylsma because I observed significant differences between his two recordings, starting with an analyzing of the ending in his earlier performance from 1979. Bylsma developed the final chords using an arpeggiated rhythmic motif. However, in the 1992 recording, he doesn't add any major changes to Was It Written. He simply plays the chords separately as an adorned arpeggios and adds a few passing motifs towards the end. Most notably, he also adds a descending scale connecting bars 62 and 63, which reinforce the sense of conclusion. Let's listen to. And that's the second version. One parameter affected is tempo. The graph shows a comparison between the tempo of these two recordings, focusing on the final section and measured in semiquavers. As we can see, the 1979 recording, represented in blue, has a faster and more variable tempo due to the arpeggiated motif. However, the 1992 recording, represented in red, has a slower and more stable tempo at the semiquaver level because of a more static interpretation of the chords. Another parameter closely related to tempo is note duration. As shown on the screen, in the 1979 recording reveals a tendency to lengthen the first semiquaver of each bar to emphasize it. Technically, this decision also favors the bow grip on the string, creating the necessary impulse for the bow's movement. Therefore, this lengthening can be considered both an interpretative decision and a technical requirement of the instrument. In the 1992 recording, the semiquavers are played more regularly within each bar, with only the first note of bar 63 and the last note of the piece being emphasized. The second section analyzes the standout for the alternation between the arpeggiated motif and the descending scale motif, where the last note of the scale is the first note of the next arpeggio. This overlap means that orally, the first beat of each bar simultaneously marks the end of one motif and the beginning of the next. In addition, the first note of each bar traces an ascending movement in conjunct degrees, reinforcing the oral sensation of polyphony. The two motifs are intertwined in the interpretation, simulating two voices. Let's listen to it. And the second. This results in a natural tendency towards an arc phrasing in each bar, which begins after the first note. To achieve this, Bylsma slowed down the tempo between the first and the second note by lengthening the first semiquaver of each bar. However, he doesn't increase its audible duration, but uses the extra fraction of time to make a micropause at a rest or a breath. Furthermore, in both recordings, Bylsma adds an additional micropause between the fifth and the sixth semiquaver of the bar. This moment mirrors the previous one. The fifth semiquaver concludes the arpeggio and at the same time starts the next scale. These micropauses were probably introduced to emphasize the hidden polyphony. Finally, it's interesting to note that despite the 30 years gap between the two recordings, the chords in this section are almost identical, suggesting that his approach of this passage hasn't changed. This contrasts with the final part. In the final section of the prelude, I connect Bill's interpretative decision with periphrasis, polylogia, synonymia, and polyptoton. Periphrasis occurs when he modifies this section by adding new musical motifs. In the 1979 recording, this is especially evident as he transformed the static chords into a repetitive arpeggiated motif. At the bar level, I relate this to polylogia, and in the section to synonymia. Both are related to the repetition of musical motifs in the same section, but the difference is that the first occurs when the same pitches are repeated, and the second occurs when that musical motif is repeated with different pitches. For this finale, Billsma chose the same rhythmic motif from the prelude of the first suite, which is also similar to the arpeggiated motifs that dominate the prelude of the third. This is related to the polyptoton, which consists on the repetition of a melodic idea in a different register or in a different part. By reusing motifs, Billsma not only creates an independent discourse within the second suite, but also establishes connections with the preceding and the subsequent suites, providing the listener with a sense of continuity. Let's listen. And this is the beginning for the first suite. And this is a middle section of third suite. In the 1992 version, Billsma established connections with the prelude itself by playing the chords as an adorned arpeggios, reusing the initial motif of the prelude. In this case, I will relate it to the periphrasis because of this small modification in the chords, and to the polyptoton since it repeats the initial motif in a different part. Thank you. Oops. Now we listen to the initial part of the... As I said before, in the fragment between bars 54 and 57, there is an oral ambiguity about where the strong beat is, reinforcing using micropauses. In reference to this, I find two new rhetorical figures, the seminialifa and the diastole. We hear how Billsma ends the phrase on the first semiquaver of the following bar with the intention of not cutting the descending scale, creating the sensation that the pulses have shifted by a semiquaver. Furthermore, the synonymia continues by maintaining the interpretation and articulation of the passage throughout the different bars, but changing the pitches. Finally, after this analysis, I have observed that Anner Billsma changed his vision and interpretation of some passages of the second suite prelude over a period of 13 years. At present, I don't know the reason for his change in interpretation, but it's clear orally and empirically, based on the analysis of the parameters, that his two interpretations of this suite didn't transmit the same message. It'd be interesting to see if this occurs with another performer, or if there are even common trends among them. It's particularly notable how Bielsma creates connection with the prelude itself by reusing the initial motif at the end of the 1992 recording, and with other preludes by reusing rhythmic motifs from them in the 1979 recording. In the first case, he created a circular feeling of by beginning and ending in the same way. And in the second, he creates a sense of continuity between the first three suites and specifically between the three preludes. Starting from this point, it will be interesting to see in future analysis if there are other relationships between the other preludes in this complete recording and if the same things happen with another interpreter. By relating this interpretative decision to rhetorical figures, I have attempted to show how linguistic resources and techniques of persuasion can be transcribed into the musical realm through performance rather than composition. In this way, attention is focused on the final and intrinsic result of music, which is how it's heard. In the following slides, you can see a selected reference. You can ask me if there are too much, I think. And many. I put all the people. And thanks so much for your attention. So many bibliographies.